If you like this kind of content, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where you'll get early access to my tutorials as well as the unedited full-length videos. Hey guys, welcome back to this fourth part of the Obi-Wan Kenobi Tutorial Series. In this video we're going to go over some cloth sculpting and detailing techniques that I use on my projects, as well as posing our character, and finally exporting out to be used in Maya. One thing to mention right at the start is that unfortunately the modeling blockout video for the cloth inside of Maya was corrupt, so I'm unable to show my polygon modeling process here. For anybody that's interested in polygon modeling inside of Maya, just leave me a comment down below and I'll make a quick separate video for that. So before we start, let's just talk a little bit about how cloth naturally folds. So there are three major folds for cloth to look out for when you're sculpting. The first one is with a single or linear anchor point at the top of the object, which allows the cloth to drape down naturally. This causes a kind of ripple effect from top to bottom, which can be often seen in capes or curtains. The second one is with multiple anchor points on the object, which causes the folds to flow from right to left and vice versa, allowing the folds to overlap each other. Again, this effect can be seen in capes and also just in regular clothing work. The third one is when two forces are being applied to the cloth from opposite ends, causing bunching to happen in the cloth. This is commonly seen on tightly fitted shirts on the arms, or where the belt is pushing up on the clothing. The thinner the cloth, the smaller and tighter these folds will be. I've drawn on my reference to give me a better idea of where the major folds will be. Almost all of the time on clothing, the major folds will be merging into each other. It's important to look out for this in your reference and try to replicate it in your sculpt. So back in Zbrush now, you can see that I've roughly modelled some geometry for the three clothing pieces that will be shown in my renders. Each of them have evenly spaced polygons, and they've all been UV'd onto the same UDIM. I'm going to start off with the small neck scarf piece to warm up with. The first thing that I'll do is to store a morph target. I'll subdivide my mesh a few times, and then I'll go back into subdivision level 1 and switch the morph target. This will just allow me to keep all that original volume that was in my base mesh without smoothing it out too much. I've already modelled a lot of the tighter folds straight into my mesh, so there's not a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of sculpting the major folds. However, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that it looks natural. I'm starting off by using the Move Topological brush and making sure that everything is evenly spaced and in the correct position. One of the major problems that I see with new artists that are working on cloth is that the folds look lumpy and irregular. For cloth like this, I want to make sure that it's smooth and tightly folded, originating from the anchor points at the back of the neck, and then gradually getting slightly looser as they come forward towards the front. For any edges that are looking a little bit too thin, I'll use the inflate brush to thicken them up a little bit. This can also help to give the fold a tighter overlap on the surrounding geometry. I'm always looking at my reference during this stage. My knowledge of cloth sculpting just isn't good enough to try and freehand it. I'm constantly trying to determine how thin the cloth is and how much volume each fold has and where it's flowing into. This is the only way that I can get some good results. Masking off certain areas that you don't want to affect, and then using the move brush on the folds that you do want to, is a great way to get the folds to look tighter. Like I said before, we want the folds to be tightest, closest to the anchor point, and then slowly and gradually get looser as they come more towards the front of the neck. I'm skipping ahead now. Once I have all the primary folds into position, I can start working on the secondary forms of the cloth. The main brush I'm using now is the damp standard brush. With a fairly low intensity and a large radius, I'm using it to carve out the smaller creases. Cloth is a little bit like skin in that wherever there's a concave crease in the geometry, it's usually surrounded by a convex volume to maintain its shape. I'm using the Alt key with the damp standard brush, which results in the opposite effect of the concave crease, giving me a tightly formed convex shape for the volumes. Again, there's no real trick to this, it's just looking at your reference and trying to mimic those secondary shapes. Sometimes if you're finding it difficult to see those shapes in your reference, it helps to try and determine the fabric material and then just do a simple Google search for the folds of that fabric material. Whenever I want to create some more primary folds in my mesh, I start off by blocking in the major volumes with either a standard brush or a clay build-up brush. I'll then use the Alt key with the damp standard brush to refine these folds and create a sharper convex crease. I'll then need to remember that wherever I've increased volume in one area, I'll need to decrease the volume in the surrounding areas. So I'll just use the regular damp standard brush to do that. I'll then just repeat these techniques, constantly referring to my reference and working around the model until I'm happy with it. This isn't the best cloth sculpt in the world, but it's not distracting either, so in my case it does the job. So now that I've had a bit of a warm up on the neck scarf, I'm ready to start working on the robe. This will be slightly more difficult to do as there are no folds that are modelled into the mesh, so I'll have to do all of this by hand. I'll start by performing the exact same morph target operation that I did with the neck scarf, storing the morph target first at the lowest subdivision, then dividing the mesh, and then switching the morph target in the lowest subdivision to preserve all the volumes. After that's done, I can start to block out the overall shape of the robe with the Move Topological brush. I've lined up this T-pose base mesh to the scale of my head model inside of Maya, and then imported it into Zbrush to be used as reference as to where the anchor point should be, like the neck and the back of the arms and the shoulders, as well as where the cloth should naturally fall on the model. I'm using symmetry here, working on most of the robe, but when it comes to the parting in the middle, I'll have to remember to switch it off. I should mention here that if you're not planning to animate your model, you don't need to sculpt in this T-pose like I am. At this stage, I wasn't sure what the final pose of my model would be, and I wanted to do a little bit of cloth work on the T-pose before later sculpting the cloth in the posed model. Once I have the overall clothing piece in the correct place, I can now start working on the primary folds. With the standard brush or clay build-up brushes, I want to start blocking in the larger shapes of the fold. This can be very rough for now, and it just helps me to get an idea of where the folds will eventually sit before refining them later. The robe that Obi-Wan wears is made of a thick, semi-rigid canvas material, so the three major fold types are going to be large and loose, unlike the scarf material. I feel like this kind of fabric is a lot more forgiving in terms of getting the look right. Thinner fabrics are a lot more difficult to get right because of the way that they cling to the skin more. you not only have to be aware of how the fabric is folding, but also of the anatomy of the body that it's clinging to. With this kind of fabric, I don't need to worry too much about that, just that it's in the correct position. The fold under the belt is a mixture of the second fold type and the third fold type. There are 2 anchor points on either side of the back, on the muscle just under the shoulder blade. This is making the folds hang from left to right and vice versa, around the waist before it transitions into the third fold type, bunching up as the belt forces it upwards. Just like I did with the scarf, using the damp standard brush with a large radius and a low intensity in combination with the Alt key can give the inverse effect, which can really define those blocked out folds. I'll keep refining these shapes, studying my reference as I go until I'm happy with them. When I'm ready to start working on the arms, I want to block out all the major primary shapes first, like I did with the belt fold. There's one main fold on the arms in my reference that goes from a type 2 fold with the 2 anchor points on either shoulder that runs right down the length of the arm into a type 1 fold draping off the forearm. Again, I use the same techniques as earlier, using the standard or clay build-up brushes to block in the overall fold shape, ready to be refined later. I'm also blocking in those smaller folds that run from various positions on the arm into the main fold. I've gone into a lower subdivision here to adjust some of the larger shapes. When cloth drapes down, it tends to do so in a semi-linear line from the anchor point to the end point of the cloth. Having too much of a curve in the cloth as it hangs down without anything to influence it can make it look unnatural. I'm now going in with the damp standard brush to define those folds. I have to make sure that wherever there's a lot of volume in the fold, I have to reduce the volume in the surrounding areas. And I also have to remember that whenever the fold is close to the anchor point, the smaller and tighter it will be, and the further away that it gets from the anchor point, the more loose it will become. I'll continue to refine and work on the cloth until I think it's in a good place that matches my reference. I'll just use the exact same process with the tabard as I did with the other cloth pieces, using a morph target to keep the volumes, blocking in the shapes, and then refining it. Luckily, this tabard piece only had one major fold type, so it didn't take too long to do. When it comes to posing my character, I like to do a quick block out in Maya first, with a basic rig that I've had on my computer for a while. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can find this rig. Once I had the rig in the position that I wanted, I then brought in my head model, and with soft selection enabled, I rotated the head into the rig's position. This isn't really necessary to do, and I don't normally do this on my projects, but I was just using this posed head model to also make some test renders inside of Maya. Once I'm happy with the blockout pose, I then combine the meshes and then export for Zbrush. Now back inside Zbrush, I'll go to the subtool palette and append a new polymesh 3D and import in my posed model. Once my mesh is imported, I'll start to go in and fix any weird deformations that are happening with my mesh by using the move brush and smooth brush. I'll also look for any irregularities with the proportions, and by using my knowledge of anatomy, I'll start to clean them up, reducing the muscles in some areas and then moving the bones into the correct place. When I'm ready to start posing my mesh, I'll first make sure that I'm in the highest subdivision level, and then go to the Layers panel where I'll create a new layer and call it Pose. Going back into the Geometry panel, I'll go back down to subdivision level 1, and by pressing Ctrl, click and drag on my canvas, I'll mask off the areas of my subtool, in this case the head, that I want to move and rotate. To remove areas of the mask, I'm using Ctrl, Alt, click and drag. Once I'm happy with my selection, I'll go back to the masking palette, select the inverse, and press Ctrl and click on my model to soften out the edge of the mask. Now, with the Move and Rotate Transpose tools, I'll line up my tool in the position of the spine, and then I'll move my head to line up with my blocked out mesh. This posing of the character doesn't have to be exact right now. I actually come back into Zbrush a few times during this project to repose, once I have a better understanding of my camera inside of Maya. I know this probably isn't the best way of posing a character inside of Zbrush, but it gets the job done. If anyone would like to share their method, please post a link in the comments below. Once I'm happy with the pose, I'll go back into the Geometry panel and view it at the highest subdivision. The best thing about this layering method is that you can easily turn off and on the iterations as you go, and so you're not destroying any of the previous work that you've done. Now that the head is posed, I'll start to work my way through the other subtools. I'll create a pose layer, mask the parts that I want to move, invert the mask and soften the edge, and then line up with the transpose tools and rotate and move the model into the posed position. A good way to fix any overlapping polys or distorted geometry is to split the parts of the model into polygroups. When I UV'd my model, I split out the arms into separate islands, and then inside of Zbrush, in the polygroups panel, I selected auto group from UVs. By doing this, I can really take a look at the tight crevices under the armpits or the elbows, and can fix any topology issues that might be stretching or squashing the polygons too much by using the move and smooth brushes. With any cloth pieces, I usually like to get all the pieces blocked out first in the correct position before working on any fold details. There might have been a little bit of wasted time when sculpting in a T-pose first, but it's up to you to determine where you want to spend your time. The folds that I put into the mesh during the T-pose stage gives me a great indication of where the folds should be once it's in the pose model. I can now just follow those fold lines of the arms, defining them and sculpting in new ones in the same direction by looking at similar reference. These folds that wrap around the arm are usually quite tight. There are two anchor points on these folds, one on the shoulder and one on the elbow. With these 2 points being so close, there's not a lot of room for the fold to relax, so it ends up being quite small and tight throughout the length of it. For the cloth detailing, I usually do it in two parts. The first will be sculpting in the larger primary forms of the fabric pattern inside a Zbrush. And then the second part is the fabric weave pattern that I'll just create in the final render in the bump slot of the shader. It was difficult to find a really high resolution reference for the details of the fabric that Obi-Wan wears, but I could see from the reference that I had that there's a strong vertical chord pattern throughout the robe and the tabard that's broken up by noise throughout. In the layers panel, I'll create a new layer and call it details. I'll then go down to the surface panel and select noise. In Photoshop, I've created this vertical line pattern, and in the alpha slot in the noise editor, I'll select it. By setting the mode to UV instead of 3D, the pattern will run along my UVs. I'll then select a suitable strength and alpha scale and apply it to my mesh. You can also do this process inside of the Displacement tab. I now want to break up those perfectly vertical lines with a bit of noise. So either in the new layer or in the same layer, I'll go back into the noise editor and turn off my previous alpha. I'll play with the scale and the strength, using the XYZ scale and angles at the bottom of the editor to change the direction of the noise. Once I'm happy with the noise, I'll click Apply to Mesh and do the same process for the robe. I ended up changing the patterns and adding in some new surface noise levels a few times until I got the look that I wanted. And that's it for the Zbrush section of this tutorial series. Like I said, I ended up going back and forth from Maya and Zbrush a few times to get in the details that I wanted. But for the moment, we're ready to export all of our subtools out and generate some displacement maps for our models. With the subtool selected that you want to export, go to the Z Plugins tab at the top and select Multi-Map Exporter. For this project, I selected Displacement, Cavity and Mesh from the options. I set the map size to 8K, and in the exporter options, I exported my mesh at subdivision level 2. I set the displacement map to also generate from subdivision level 2, and I selected 32-bit and EXR. I left all the other settings to default. When you're ready, press Create All Maps and save to the location that you want. I'll repeat this same process for all the other subtools, ready to be imported into Maya. In the next part of this tutorial series, we're going to go through setting up our scene inside of Maya and Arnold. We're going to go over some simple lighting techniques some shader setup, and some camera controls. I hope to see you all there. Cheers guys.